Sometimes you have things lying around for ages in your stash. And this summer I rediscovered an old kaftan, one that I bought when I traveled to India in 1991. It's been a while. And here I am going to share with you how I make this kaftan into a more usable, more ordinary dress. That is, if you can call anything this green ordinary. So here is how it started. A very basic rectangular shape with just a neck hole and 2 side seams. I will be using the pattern for my Nancy shirt to make this one. And first I have to think a little bit about how to use the fabric. And here I am cutting out the front piece, but I'm making it wider than it was from the beginning because I want to use the whole width of the fabric or the kaftan. So I mark the front half of the pattern and now I'm moving it towards the side seam and marking the side seam part of the pattern. I'm very careful to keep this parallel with the folded center front line. And after I have marked the sleeve opening, the armhole, I can now join the lines of the shoulder. This part of the shirt is going to be gathered. That's why I can just simply add fabric. It's just going to mean more gathers. And when that is done, I can just simply cut it out. For the bottom edge of this front piece or the whole dress, I am using the hemline of the kaftan. It was already hemmed, so I'm using that. And now I am moving over the front piece to lay it on top of the back piece to make sure that the side seam end up being at the same length, or at least more or less the same length. I am of course also making the back piece wider, or once again using the full width of the fabric. And since that line is completely straight, I'm not marking anything, I'm just cutting it. And from the leftover pieces, I'm now cutting out the back yoke. And I was a bit fussy about where I wanted to place this one because I wanted to use as much as possible of this pretty nice print or batik. And I'm actually not really sure if it is printed or proper batik. I'm leaning towards actually printed, but it still looks very nice. The next step here is to cut the sleeves. I am placing the pattern piece along the side edge of the kaftan. Once again, it's already hemmed and I'm going to use that. And I'm going to make these sleeves very short. That's why most of the pattern piece is sticking out outside of the fabric. But that is intentional and that is, there isn't any more fabric, so I have to do it this way. And speaking of leftovers, there isn't a lot left now of this kaftan. I am starting with cutting out the outside collar from a whole piece of fabric, and after that I'm moving on to the front plackets. Now I want the plackets to be pretty long. The whole dress is sort of a lot of fabric and a very intense color, and I don't want the front placket to look tiny and sort of misplaced. So I'm wanting it to be pretty long, and therefore I have to piece it. But a seam right across the front placket looks a little silly, so I'm making it into a small decoration. I want it to look intentional. You're going to see what I mean in just a few seconds. First, I am cutting out the second part, the inner part of the collar, which I had to piece in no less than 3 places. But it worked out just fine. And the last and final part to cut out is the pockets. And by now, there was really nothing left of the fabric. So I had to pick an ordinary black fabric, and Fraser the cat is helping. And hey, it's time to start the sewing. These threads I had at home, none of them looked good. I actually had to go out and buy thread for this project. And that is not so surprising with this very special green color. Now I am starting with the front plackets. As you can see, I have the seam right across in the middle of them, and I'm covering that seam with a small piece of fabric that I'm stitching on top of it. And it looks actually quite good and intentional. And what you see here are the front plackets pressed into their final shape. And that means that I have folded and pressed all the edges of these plackets in. And I have also folded it over to make it double. And what I do next is to cut the front of the dress open almost all the way down to the end of the placket, but I'm leaving a little bit of seam allowance. And then I am placing the placket with the underside and the overside both pinned in place, covering this cut edge at the same time. So when I am top stitching this one in place, I am doing it all through the upper side, the dress and the underside of the placket at the same time. I am also making sure that both the dress and the placket are kept very sort of flat when I'm pinning this to get a nice look. I'm doing that by holding it down with my right hand and using the fingers of the left hand to hold both the dress and the placket sort of a bit taut when I'm pinning it. And it's a good trick to know how to use to get a very nice finish. Now I am pinning the placket in place. I'm marking where it's supposed to go. I'm usually marking with pins, as I'm doing here, pinning the top part in place and folding the other one under as I pressed it. I'm leaving a little bit open at the bottom, and I am just simply pushing the bottom placket under and keeping the top placket on top of this little gap that I've cut here. I cut to the corners of the seams. Now, if there is a bit of extra fabric below the placket, that is not a problem, because it's very traditional to end up with a few small pleats there, as I have done here. I'm just folding it in a nice way and just leaving it there. It looks just traditional. As the placket is already ironed into its final shape, it's very easy to get nice neat corners here. I am just making sure that none of the edges folded under are sticking out in any way. I am pinning it in place and then I'm sewing it. First I am top stitching along the long sides of the placket, and then I'm sewing this little, little cross reinforcement at the bottom of the placket. And now it's time to attach the front pieces to the yoke. But first I am starting with the collar. As I said, I had to piece the collar in several places, so I am now pinning the inner and the outer collar together. I am once again double checking with the pattern, because when you make so many extra seams, so much piecing, it's very easily happen that you lose shape. I sew them together and I am trimming the seam allowance, turning the collar and pressing it into the right shape. And now I am gathering the front pieces to match up with the yoke. I am pinning it in place and making sure that, of course, they match up in length. Here I'm showing you how I do my gathering stitches. I sew one seam with very long stitches and loose tension on one side of the final seam, and then another gathering seam on the other side of the final seam. So I have one row of gathering on each side of the seam, and then I pull on the threads and gather the fabric. This is how I do it. That's how I learned to do it when I learned sewing and tailoring. Now we have the collar. I am sewing it right side to the neck opening. I am pressing that seam, and now I am folding it under. I'm folding the seam allowance under on the inner side or the underside of the collar, and then I will be top stitching this in place all around the collar. And you know what? Everything was going so well, and then I ended up with this sort of strange bubbly fabric here. I really tried to press this. I really tried to I mean, yeah, I was thinking everything was going well, but I'm definitely not unpicking the collar to fix this. So let's move on. It's time for pockets. So here's how I do my favorite pockets. I'm starting with these little black bananas that I'm sewing onto the front piece of the dress, right side to right side, along the edge, cutting away this little piece, turning it around to the inside and stitching it down. Now I have an opening. And on the back side, I just put this bigger piece of the pocket bag onto the fabric and top stitch it in place around the bigger pocket bag. And when the side seam is closed, voila, you have a pocket. And after that, we're of course onto the sleeves. I'm pinning them into the armhole, sleeve opening, and I am sewing them and overlocking the seam. And then I did a quick try on, and it didn't look really good. There's way too much fabric in the front. So I am pinning here now a dart in the front to sort of give it a little bit more of a proper shape. And this dart, since the sleeves go very far down along the side seam, the darts will go partially into the sleeve, but that is not a problem. It makes the side seam very uneven, but that is also not a problem since we have so much fabric. The pocket, on the other hand, is a bit of a problem. I really should have unpicked it and moved it further into the front piece, but I didn't do it. So it has a little bit of a strange shape along the side seam, but it's fine. By the way, don't forget to hit the like button if you like this video. I started to pin the side seam, but I realized I really should try it on first, and it looked way better. And I sewed the side seams together. Under the sleeve I felled the seam allowances down, but the rest of the side seam are actually the selvage. And lucky for me, the bottom edge was already hemmed from the beginning of this kaftan. Now, unfortunately, since I made a dart in the front, it ended up being shorter in the side seam. So there is a difference. I could shorten the back piece in the future, or I could just leave it as it is. Don't tell anyone. And now we're getting closer to finished. The front placket I am closing, sewing the bottom half of it closed. I don't need any buttons there since I'm not going to open it. And I raided my stash of buttons. It wasn't easy, this color is special, but I found 2 buttons and that's all we need. And the last step was to make the 2 buttonholes and sew the 2 buttons in. Now I just have to wait for some nice weather to show off this dress that I made out of kaftan. Am I super happy with it? Yeah, maybe it is a bit too much fabric in the front, but it is totally fine as a beach cover-up or similar. Thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to give it a thumbs up or a like if you like it. Thank you and bye!